Picture this moment if you can. You're lying there, your body torn apart after 3 agonizing days of labor. Blood is everywhere. Your vision is fading. Death is creeping closer with each labored breath. And just meters away from your bed, your husband, the man who promised to love and cherish you, faces an impossible choice: your life or your unborn child's life. But he doesn't hesitate, not even for a heartbeat. He looks the court physicians directly in their eyes and speaks words that will echo through history. Save the boy. Queens are replaceable. Those words cut through the air like a blade, and somehow, through your delirium and pain, you hear them. Your heart shatters completely before your body finally surrenders. 12 days later, you draw your final breath, knowing you gave this man absolutely everything. Your youth, your dreams, your very life. And it still wasn't enough. But this wasn't just any husband making this brutal choice. This was Henry VIII, the most feared and powerful monarch in all of Europe. And you were Jane Seymour, his third wife, the woman history tells us he truly loved above all others, the only wife he chose to be buried beside when his own time came. Yet if she was indeed the great love of his life, why did he so coldly choose to sacrifice her? Why did he value a son he had never even held over the woman who had just endured 3 days of torture to give him that very child? What really happened in that royal chamber goes far deeper than any fairy tale romance. The truth about Jane Seymour and Henry VIII reveals one of history's most disturbing examples of manipulation, ambition, and the deadly price women paid for royal power in Tudor England. Here's what they never taught you in school about this so-called love story. Jane Seymour entered this world around 1508, born into a family of minor nobility struggling to maintain their position in English society. Her father, Sir John Seymour, held the title of knight, but the family's coffers were nearly empty. While daughters of wealthy nobles learned French, Latin, music, and the art of courtly conversation, Jane learned practical skills: needlework, household management, and most importantly, how to remain invisible when powerful people were speaking. According to historical records from the British National Archives, Jane could barely write her own name when she first arrived at Henry's court. She was what Tudor society cruelly labeled a leftover daughter. 25 years old and still unmarried, which in those days marked her as practically ancient and undesirable. She possessed no substantial dowry, no influential family connections, and contemporary accounts describe her as pale, unremarkable, and painfully shy. Jane's role at court was that of a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. Essentially, she was a well-born servant, invisible furniture in the grand drama of royal politics. She watched from the shadows as Henry's 24-year marriage to Catherine crumbled over the Queen's inability to produce a living male heir. She witnessed the arrival of the dark-eyed, sharp-tongued Anne Boleyn, who swept through the court like a hurricane, turning centuries of tradition upside down. Through it all, Jane perfected the art of invisibility. Her family had drilled into her one crucial survival lesson: women who spoke too boldly or wanted too much ended up discarded or worse. Her mother, Lady Marjorie Seymour, constantly reminded her daughters that a woman's greatest asset was her ability to agree with everyone and never cause trouble. Jane absorbed this lesson completely, becoming a master of silent compliance.
The Venetian ambassador, writing to his government in 1536, described Jane as a woman of the greatest gentleness and humanity, but noted that she was not a woman of great wit or beauty. In Tudor court language, this was diplomatic code for saying she was boring and plain. She had spent a decade perfecting the art of being forgettable. But sometimes, being forgettable is exactly what makes you noticed by the right person at precisely the wrong moment. By 1535, Henry VIII was growing increasingly frustrated with his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Anne was everything Jane was not: dark where Jane was fair, loud where Jane was quiet, intellectually challenging where Jane was submissive. Henry had already torn apart his first marriage, broken England away from the Catholic Church, and risked war with European powers to marry Anne. Now, after 3 years of marriage and multiple failed pregnancies, Anne had still not given him the male heir he desperately needed. Henry began looking for something completely different from the fiery, unpredictable Anne. Jane Seymour represented everything he remembered fondly about his first wife, Catherine: obedience, traditional Catholic values, and, most importantly, the kind of quiet submission that made a king feel truly powerful. The Spanish Chronicle, a contemporary source, records that Jane never argued with His Majesty's wishes and always agreed with whatever he proposed. This wasn't love at first sight, it was a strategic assessment. Henry wasn't falling for Jane's personality, he was attracted to her complete lack of one. The first warning sign that should have terrified Jane came when Henry began sending her expensive gifts while still married to Anne Boleyn. We're talking about jewelry worth thousands of pounds in today's money, silk dresses imported from France, and passionate love letters, all directed toward a woman who was not his wife. Jane initially showed some moral backbone, actually returning a purse full of gold coins, with a message stating she could not accept gifts from a married man. But instead of respecting this ethical stance, Henry became even more excited by what he saw as playing hard to get. This was never about honor or propriety, it was about the thrill of conquest. Jane's ambitious brothers, Edward and Thomas Seymour, recognized the opportunity immediately and pressured her sister to accept the king's advances. They completely ignored the obvious and terrifying pattern: if Henry was plotting against his current wife while pursuing Jane, he would eventually do the same to her. They thought Jane was rising to power, but she was actually walking directly into the same trap that Anne Boleyn was about to spring. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Trapwise, wrote to Emperor Charles V in March 1536 that the king's fancy for the Seymour girl grows daily stronger, while noting that Anne Boleyn was in great fear and distress about her husband's obvious infidelity. The court was essentially watching Henry audition Jane as Anne's replacement, while Anne was still very much alive and still queen. The Seymour family orchestrated Jane's positioning with military precision. They arranged for her to be given chambers directly above Henry's private apartments, connected by a secret staircase. So while Anne Boleyn struggled through another difficult pregnancy, desperately trying to give Henry the son that would secure her position, Jane Seymour was literally positioned above her, waiting for her opportunity. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its calculation. Henry would appear at Jane's chambers unannounced, showering her with the kind of romantic attention she had never experienced from any man. For a woman who had been invisible her entire life, this royal courtship felt like a miracle. But the Seymours had coached Jane perfectly on how to respond. Act modest, act pure, act like everything Anne Boleyn was not.
When Anne's pregnancy ended in miscarriage in January 1536, possibly triggered by the stress of watching her husband publicly court another woman, Henry's mask came off completely. Within days, he was openly discussing Jane as his next wife, and Anne as an obstacle to be removed. The most chilling moment came when Henry visited Jane just hours after Anne Boleyn was arrested and dragged to the Tower of London on fabricated charges of adultery, treason, and witchcraft. He found Jane quietly embroidering in her chamber, the picture of domestic tranquility. "You are going to be Queen of England," he announced casually, as if Anne had simply vanished rather than been arrested on charges that everyone knew would result in her execution. Jane's response reveals everything about her character and her situation. According to court records, she did not ask what had happened to Anne. She did not question why everything was moving so quickly. She did not express any concern about the fate of the woman whose crown she was about to wear. She simply nodded, thanked the king, and continued her needlework. This was not romance. This was a business transaction disguised as a love story. The wedding took place on May 30th, 1536, exactly 11 days after Anne Boleyn's head was severed from her body on Tower Green. 11 days. The same courtiers who had bowed reverently to Anne for 3 years seamlessly transferred their loyalty to Jane, as if Anne Boleyn had never existed. Jane wore white silk, supposedly symbolizing purity, while marrying a man who had just executed his previous wife to make room for her. Contemporary accounts note how small and pale Jane appeared next to Henry, who had grown enormous and intimidating as he aged. Throughout the ceremony, Jane kept her eyes downcast and spoke so quietly that witnesses could barely hear her recite her vows. This was not a radiant bride beginning the happiest day of her life. This was a woman who understood she was entering into a contract, not a marriage. Henry immediately began planning Jane's coronation ceremony, but kept postponing it under various pretexts. He claimed concerns about plague in London, but the real reason was much simpler and more brutal. Jane's only value lay in her ability to produce living children. Until she proved she could deliver a healthy son, she was essentially on probation. The royal apartments were redecorated according to what Henry claimed were Jane's preferences, but servants whispered that the king had chosen everything himself. Jane had become Queen of England, but she was not truly queen of anything, not even her own bedroom. We often hear that Jane was Henry's favorite wife, the woman he truly loved, the only one he chose to be buried beside when his own time came. But is that the complete story? If he loved her so profoundly, why did he marry 3 more women after her death? Was it genuine love, or merely relief and gratitude that she had finally given him his precious male heir? Jane's greatest mistake was believing Henry when he said he valued her thoughts and opinions. In October 1536, a massive rebellion known as the Pilgrimage of Grace erupted across northern England. More than 30,000 Catholics rose up, furious about Henry's destruction of monasteries and his break with Rome. The rebels specifically demanded that Jane be crowned queen, seeing her as a symbol of the old Catholic traditions they wanted restored.
Jane made the fatal error of thinking Henry actually wanted her political input. She knelt before him in front of the entire court and begged him to show mercy to the rebels and consider restoring some of the religious houses he had dissolved. Her plea was heartfelt and carefully reasoned, exactly the kind of thoughtful counsel a wise king should want from his queen. Henry's reaction was swift and terrifying. According to eyewitness accounts, he turned on Jane with such fury that courtiers fled the room in fear. "Remember what happened to your predecessor," he snarled, his hand moving instinctively to the dagger at his belt. "Queens who meddle in politics do not last long in this realm." That single threat revealed everything about their relationship. Jane never spoke about political matters again, but the damage was irreversible. Henry now viewed her as potentially disloyal, just like Anne Boleyn had become. She had demonstrated that she possessed thoughts beyond producing his children, and that made her dangerous in his eyes. Jane's second fatal error was believing Henry's promises about their future together. He constantly spoke about all the sons they would have, the dynasty they would build, the long and happy life that stretched ahead of them. Jane began planning for a future that Henry never truly intended for her to see. She requested tutors to improve her limited education, hoping to become a worthy intellectual companion for her brilliant husband. She studied French and Latin, practiced her handwriting for hours each day, and tried to transform herself into the Renaissance queen she believed Henry wanted. But Henry's interest in Jane as a person was already fading by their first Christmas together. He spent more time drinking and hunting with his male companions than conversing with his new wife. When Jane finally became pregnant in early 1337, Henry's attention shifted entirely to her belly rather than her as a human being. She was no longer Jane Seymour, the woman. She had become simply the vessel-carrying art prince, as Henry constantly referred to the unborn child. The pregnancy progressed normally until October, when Jane went into labor. What followed was every woman's nightmare in an age before modern medicine. Jane labored in agony for 3 full days while the royal physicians realized that something was going terribly wrong. Both mother and child were in mortal danger, and 16th century medical knowledge offered no solutions. According to several historical sources, including accounts by the imperial ambassador, the court physicians approached Henry with an impossible choice. They could attempt to save the queen, or they could focus all of their efforts on delivering the prince alive. But trying to save both might result in losing them both. Henry's response was immediate and chilling. Save the boy. England needs an heir, and queens can be replaced. Some accounts suggest Jane was conscious enough to hear this exchange. Others believe she sensed the decision in the way everyone suddenly stopped looking at her face and focused entirely on her laboring body. When Prince Edward was finally born on October 12, 1337, Henry was ecstatic. He had his male heir at last, the son who would secure the Tudor dynasty. But Jane was dying. Massive blood loss and puerperal sepsis, childbed fever, were claiming her life. The choice had been made, and she had been the sacrifice.
Henry visited her once after the birth, thanked her for giving him his prince, and then essentially said goodbye forever. While Jane lay dying from infection and complications, fighting for every breath, Henry was too busy celebrating his son and planning England's political future to waste precious time with a wife who had already served her purpose. Jane kept asking her ladies-in-waiting to summon the king, begging them to bring Henry back to see her one more time. But he was occupied with more important matters, receiving congratulations from foreign ambassadors, planning Prince Edward's christening ceremony, and writing triumphant letters to European monarchs about his great success. The christening took place on October 15th, just 3 days after Edward's birth. Jane was so weak from blood loss and fever that she had to be carried to the ceremony on a stretcher, wrapped in velvet robes and ermine to hide how gravely ill she had become. She could barely hold her head upright, but Henry insisted she appear in public one final time to display their success to the world. After the christening ceremony, Jane collapsed completely. The official court records stopped mentioning her entirely, as if she had already ceased to exist. While Jane fought desperately for her life in her chambers, Henry was busy writing congratulatory letters to European kings, securing new political alliances, and basking in the glory of finally having his male heir. The woman who had given him everything he wanted was already forgotten while she still drew breath. Jane Seymour died alone on October 24, 1337, surrounded only by her ladies-in-waiting and the royal physicians who had done everything possible to save her. She was just 28 years old, and she had been queen for less than 18 months. Henry was not present when she took her final breath. According to court records, he was in another wing of the palace, reportedly too distraught to witness her death. But his actions in the following days told a very different story about his grief. Jane was given a queen's funeral, the only wife of Henry VIII to receive this honor. Henry wore black mourning clothes and spoke fondly of her memory. When his own time came 29 years later, he chose to be buried alongside her at Windsor Castle. These facts have led many historians to conclude that Jane was indeed Henry's one true love. But was she really? Or was this just another carefully constructed royal myth? Let's examine what actually happened after Jane's death. Henry did wear mourning black and spoke reverently of Jane's memory. He commissioned a beautiful tomb and seemed genuinely saddened by her loss. For the first time in his reign, the court did not see him immediately rushing into another marriage. People whispered that perhaps she really had been the one. However, Henry's next moves revealed the truth about his feelings. Within 2 years, he was actively seeking a new wife through diplomatic channels. His grief, while perhaps genuine in the moment, did not prevent him from pursuing marriage alliances across Europe. Love stories at the Tudor court rarely stayed static for long, especially when political advantages were at stake. Looking back with modern understanding, Jane Seymour's story reads like a textbook case of psychological manipulation that we would immediately recognize today. The love-bombing phase, where Henry showered her with gifts and attention. The isolation from family and friends as she became completely dependent on his approval. The constant monitoring and control of her behavior. The threats disguised as protective concern.
Jane believed that giving Henry his son would prove her worth and secure her place in his heart forever. Instead, it simply confirmed what he had always believed. She was replaceable. Her death was not a devastating tragedy that destroyed him emotionally. It was simply clearing the path for his next conquest. The saddest truth is that Jane died believing she was genuinely loved. She thought she was Henry's favorite wife, his true soulmate, the woman who had finally understood and satisfied him completely. The reality was far more brutal. She had never been anything more than a temporary solution to Henry's permanent obsession, his desperate need for a legitimate male heir. But here's the question that haunts Jane Seymour's story. If she truly was the wife Henry loved most deeply, why did he so coldly choose to sacrifice her life for a son he had never even met? Why did he abandon her in her final days when she needed him most? And why did he spend the remainder of his life seeking new wives if Jane had been his perfect match? The answer lies not in romance, but in the brutal mathematics of Tudor politics. Jane Seymour was never Henry's beloved wife. She was his most successful business investment. She gave him the male heir that legitimized his reign and secured his dynasty. Her death was not a tragic loss of love. It was simply clearing the path for his next conquest. Jane Seymour deserved so much better than being remembered merely as the wife who gave Henry his son and died in the process. She deserved to be remembered as a young woman who died believing in a love that existed only in her imagination, manipulated by men who valued her solely for her reproductive capacity. Her story is not a fairy tale romance between a king and his true love. It is a cautionary tale about the deadly price women paid for royal ambition in Tudor England, and a reminder that even queens could be nothing more than pawns in men's political games. The next time someone tells you that Jane Seymour was Henry VIII's great love, remember her final days, dying alone while he celebrated their son, abandoned by the man who had promised to cherish her, sacrificed for an heir who would rule England for only 6 years before dying young himself. That is the real story of Jane Seymour, not a love story, but a tragedy that reveals the true cost of power in Tudor England.